going to work her magic and hit the magic button now.
Yeah, done.
So welcome to the fourth of our series of events to celebrate and share the fantastic work you've been doing to mobilise evidence and knowledge in your organisations. If you've not yet had the use the chat function, tell us who you are, where you are today, and what you hope to get out of the session. And for those of you that are Twitterati, if you want to tweet about the session today, the hashtag is KNOWvember, spelt KNOW20. You can go to the next slide, please, Alison. So the aim of today's session is for you to consider how technologies are enabling new ways of working and what the role might be for the knowledge specialist in the digital workplace. Our speaker today is Nicola Millard, who is going to be talking about D's shaping the digital workforce and a workplace. And in the second part of the session, we're going to try our very best to hold a virtual fishbowl to continue the conversation. Next slide, please, Alison. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Nicola Millard, who's the Principal Innovation Partner at BT. Nicola's had a long and varied career at BT and has been involved with a number of BT firsts, including the first application of artificial intelligence into BT's call centres, BT's initial experiments with home working, and helping to develop BT's Net Easy score, which is a new way of measuring customer experience. Currently, she's looking at innovation in both employee and customer experience using technologies from disciplines such as design thinking, psychology, anthropology, computing, and business consulting to generate data. So they can engage and create conversations from boardroom to the frontline research. So I'm going to hand the floor to Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So hello, everybody. I'm going to try and let's do a bit of a conferencing bingo and see if I can share my slides. I always say, can you see my slides? Only scores 1 on conferencing bingo because along with you're on mute. Too common. Sorry, not big point scorers. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola. I did used to be BT's futurologist. That was my official job title, and yeah, you'll notice my job title's got a little bit more boring recently. I'm kind of glad because having a title of futurologist always used to provoke the same question, which is, do you have a crystal ball? And someone very kindly gave me one, actually, but I can categorically tell you that crystal balls don't work. So my job is a lot more interesting than reading crystal balls or indeed tea leaves. I'm actually an academic and a researcher, so I am very much into data, as you will find out in this presentation. And I hope, given that most of you are also into knowledge, I hope that that you're probably a bit data geeky as well, to be honest. So hopefully I can get through some stats and some graphs and make them interesting. So I'm part of BT's innovation team. I always say that the first thing I have to do is to actually tell people that BT does innovation, because BT's not very good at telling anybody. We are in the top 10 of investors in the UK on innovation, and we've given up trying to count exactly where we are in the top 10 because we keep sliding up and down, and usually consistently there's usually some big pharma companies ahead of us. I think we're about number 4 or 5 at the moment, but we are a very big investor in research and innovation. So I'm currently talking to you from my kitchen, but normally I'm well, it's in Ipswich, my kitchen, but normally I'm about 7 miles down the road in Adastral Park, which is our main research and innovation headquarters. Oddly enough, I was there on Friday for the first time since March, and it was rather strange to be there. But normally I would be there. That's where the bulk of our research goes on. And it's like most companies, we don't do innovation on our own. We have this lovely innovation ecosystem. So a lot of the stuff I do, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I work a lot primarily with our university partners, and we have some fabulous university partners. So anyone from MIT over in the US, Tsinghua in China, and then slightly closer to home, we've got Cambridge and Bristol universities as our key strategic partners. But you'll also see some stuff in this session from the likes of Lancaster University, the likes of London Business School. So my job largely, I call it speed dating. So there's a ton of stuff going on in our research and innovation area. My job is to work with people like yourself. So primarily I work with large UK corporates and public sector to try and downstream some of that innovation and work with you guys on innovation as well. But I'm a slightly weird part of the innovation team in that you might expect that most people in innovation in BT are technologists. I'm not. I'm a psychologist by background. So my role is to largely look at the most disruptive part of innovation, which is, of course, not the technology. It's us. And I think looking at the future of world of work, as I have been for the past 10 years, a lot of the stuff that we're using now has been a pandemic, a crisis. But a lot of that technology was already there before the pandemic. So things like video conferencing, things like collaboration tools, things like cloud technologies were all there. It's almost the perfect time to have a pandemic, actually, because the technology platforms we're using, it has enabled us to very quickly embrace very new ways of working. And the question I have now is, what's sustainable? What are we likely to see coming out of this pandemic? What lessons can we learn? What worked well? What didn't work so well? Where can innovation help? So, as I said, I've been working in the future world of work for a long time, and all of the trends that we found prior to the pandemic are the same during the pandemic. It's just that what's happened is the pandemic has accelerated a lot of these trends. So we've seen, typically about 3 to 5 years worth of innovation happening in 8 months. So it's a really exciting time to be in innovation at the moment, to be perfectly honest. So I'm going to go through some of these trends. All of the trends begin mysteriously by the letter D. I don't really know why, apart from the fact I'm a massive Sesame Street fan, and I've always wanted to say this session comes at you. This session will come at you via the letter D. So let's explore some of the Ds, shall we? So the first D is an obvious one, to be honest. We've had a bit of disruption recently, haven't we? And I think going into the pandemic, a lot of what I was looking at was, this sudden rapid transition to new ways of working. And I mean, home working, for example, isn't new. BT's first experiment in home working, one of my first jobs in BT actually, was in 1992. It was up in Inverness. It was fondly called the Inverness experiment because, hey, we weren't that inventive, but we worked people from home as an experiment for a whole year. And I was part of the psychological monitoring panel for that because no one had ever worked from home for a year before, and we weren't entirely sure what was going to happen with their mental health. So I did a lot around, how were they feeling? And to be honest, a lot of the stuff that we found in 1992 has been very relevant to today. But I would say the biggest difference between 92 and today was all of those guys were volunteers. A lot of the home working going on at the moment is not voluntary. And I think some of us have really enjoyed it, some of us have not. Go into that in a little bit more detail, but let's have a look at some of the stats. So this is actually some research we published 2 weeks ago, so it's pretty hot off the press. It's a survey of global leaders, typically around the world, and IT decision makers as well, just looking at what they feel about, the ways of working that have been stimulated by this pandemic. And actually, largely, we're getting a good picture. Now, bear in mind, these are execs. So these are typically people largely at the top of the organization. So a lot of them have discovered that remote can work. And I think that the observation is I've been pretty productive, regardless of the fact I haven't been able to necessarily come into the office quite as much. Now, there are downsides to that as well, because I think one of the things we found in 1992, and we found certainly now, is that it's not about keeping people working when they're working from home. It's about stopping people working. And to be honest, that was one of the reasons. I mean, BT was a very big adopter of home working, and certainly into the early 2000s, we had a huge amount of people working from home. But I think we recognised that permanent home working, as we've all found, is quite hard. So we actually did pull back a bit, but I think you can see, there's another survey that the National Bureau of Economic Research did about a month ago, showing that on average our working day has gone up by about 48 minutes. So we might not be doing the commute quite so much, but our work day is still looking quite long. Now, there's a lot of comments around productivity around this. So typically, normally people cite about 20% extra productivity from people working from home compared to their permanent office-based counterparts. But actually, probably it's just we work longer when we're working from home. And there is a big question, which I will examine next, as to whether that is a good measure for productivity, and certainly a sustainable measure for productivity. So let's get on to another D. There are many, but this one is around digital itself and digital workplace. Now, I know that the NHS has had a digital workplace programme running for quite a long time. I have worked certainly with the likes of the Cabinet Office on their digital workplace stuff as well. But I think, you know, talking prior to the pandemic, pretty much every organisation, whether it be a bank or BT itself, or pretty much any of my customers, were running some form of digital workplace programme. Now, it's always interesting when you ask people, what do you mean by a digital workplace? Generally, it's dependent on who you ask as to what the answer they give. So certainly if you talk to the property people, it's all about office spaces and physical spaces. If you talk to the IT people, typically it's all about the underpinning technologies. If you talk to the HR people, it's all about employee experience and all of that lovely stuff. But that's not particularly useful, because unless we have a common definition and a common goal around the digital workplace, I would suggest it probably isn't going to succeed. So again, we asked people, you know, what do you want to get out of this digital workplace ultimately? And to be honest, the answers are not particularly surprising. Number one, to improve productivity, because, you know, if we're going to reinvent the way that we work, we probably want to make ourselves more productive rather than less. So that's the first thing. The second thing, customer experience, patient experience. That's all of that stuff is very important as well. We've been talking about that for many, many years. So how do we harness the capabilities of digital, the knowledge, to flow that around an organization and actually create better patient experiences? And then the third one has gone up the table. When we looked at these priorities 2 years ago, remote working was on the top 10 list, but it wasn't number 3. I wonder why it is now. So remote working and the ability to remote work is very much a priority now in the digital workplace. But it's also interesting that generally, if you do ask people for a definition now, it's a lot more to do with the collaboration tools that we use rather than necessarily any of the other things that I talked about earlier. I want to go back to productivity, though, because ultimately that is the number one. But I think one of the problems that we have with productivity at the moment, particularly when you are in a knowledge industry and a service industry, productivity is incredibly difficult to measure, because most of the productivity measures, quite frankly, were derived in the industrial age, when we had factories and we could see inputs and we could see outputs and we manufactured widgets in between. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've manufactured many widgets ever, to be perfectly honest, because I'm a knowledge worker in a service economy. So how do you measure me? So that's a very big research problem. So I'm not going to give you the ultimate answer here. I think there's a lot of discussion going on around what can we do in terms of productivity proxies. So how can we look at correlating things with productivity, whatever you want to measure that being? One of them obviously would be things like the number of hours we work, which, as I've said, has gone up. So it looks as if we're being very productive. But if we look at sustaining that, that's not a productive way of working. And traditionally, the research would point towards long hours cultures being very unproductive, quite simply because we get tired. And certainly if we're going to work 48 minutes a day longer for a very long time, the likelihood is we're going to not get great productivity, and we're probably going to get more burnout. So obviously another proxy would be well-being. I know Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland has been doing a lot of talk about how you could actually start to look at the well-being of an economy and very much correlate that with productivity. It's kind of a good example to follow, that New Zealand are using well-being as a key productivity marker, as is Iceland as well. So that's another one. How you measure well-being is a big debate. You might want to measure happiness, for example. You might want to measure engagement. The one I'm going to go into a little bit more, because I think it's very relevant to this audience, is an idea that Michael Schrage at MIT has been talking about for a little while, called return on idea. Because frankly, if I'm a knowledge worker, it's not the knowledge that's valuable, it's how I use the knowledge. And And this is quite interesting because it gets into human network theory, which I am geeking out a bit on at the moment. So really trying to understand how human networks work. So how do ideas actually propagate through an organization? Now, this is some work actually that Linda Grattan at London Business School did a while back, looking at how innovation works within organizations and how actually clusters of people tend to stimulate different types of innovation. So you've certainly got innovation within an organization, and that's fascinating enough to see who comes up with the ideas, how those ideas propagate through teams, how those ideas get momentum and actually implemented. But obviously it's not just within an organization that you have ideas. There are lots of other ways of getting ideas, and certainly I work in innovation. We have ecosystems to do this. So we either look at novel things, so things that have never been there before. We need to get a very multidisciplinary, diverse set of people to start to look at novel combinations. We also need to look at, maybe synthesizing ideas that have been out there. But a lot of this has to come into the core of an organization in order for it to actually be enabled. So my interest at the moment is how those networks work. And we can use data to start to track that, whether that's network data. Obviously, BT has a lot of that. Whether it's using things like Microsoft, so they have their insights data, so you can see who talks to who. And I always say human networks are very strange because they don't behave in hierarchies, for example. In fact, it's often the opposite of how knowledge is shared. The hierarchical knowledge sharing doesn't necessarily result in innovation and ideas being propagated forward until they hit the top of that hierarchy. I always use the Shakespeare analogy. So if you look at, the Montagues and the Capulets, ideally, you probably go to the heads of the families to talk to the Montagues and the Capulets and try and broker some kind of peace deal between them. But in actual fact, if you analyse the human network of the Montagues and the Capulets, you would quite rapidly find that the primary source of connection is Romeo and Juliet. So they're actually the most important part of that network initially to start to stimulate conversations. Now, I could go on about this for absolutely hours. I'm not going to, but I think it's quite an interesting one around how can we use data to understand how those human networks work better without getting horribly creepy, because I think there is a creepiness aspect to this. If I start to figure out who those key connectors are, obviously they're very important to the business, but how do I start to reward and recognize people given that they're probably not at the top of the organization? Actually, there are some profound implications for leadership as well here, because we've been saying, and Linda Grattan has been saying for quite a number of years, that the good leaders are actually good connectors. We all know those people. I call them perfect party hosts. So they know a little bit about everybody and then they connect people together. So they create a purpose for that connection. Now, the sad thing about this particular thing is not everyone is good at that. I'm rubbish, for example. I'm not the perfect party host at all. That's the bad news. The good news is it's a skill, and we've started to work into our apprenticeship program now. This ability to network. How do we actually teach people to network better? Because actually that's going to be a key skill and increasingly key if you're a very remote organization. I'm going to stop on that one because I could go on for hours, and let's take a look at, actually this is connected because this is about leadership. And in terms of the digital transformation piece, I think, as I said, the technology's been there and has been there for a while. And, that confluence of connectivity, cloud, collaboration tools, all of that lovely stuff has come together to enable us to work in very different ways. So the technology has accelerated us forward considerably. But we know that culture change moves a lot more slowly. So my anxiety at the moment is we need to do a lot of work on the culture bit in order to sustain some of the positive things that we're coming out around the sort of remote aspect of the pandemic. So there are lots of things I can unpick here. The first thing is that we've learned that leaders, particularly in remote organizations, need to trust people by default, rather than, oh, I can't see them, therefore, how do I know they're working? Which is a fairly typical command and control leadership attitude, which is mostly about presenteeism. So if you're looking at productivity proxies, the fact I can see you does not necessarily mean that you are productive, of course. And there's management styles as well. I think command and control leaders have really struggled in this pandemic. It's not a particularly good way of leading, to be perfectly honest. As Christine Derry at MIT says, management by checking up and checking in is now definitely the sort of thing that we should be doing. So a much more empathetic way of leading, a much more transparent way of leading that isn't about how many hours have you worked. It's much more around how are you actually contributing? How are you sharing your knowledge? But I do think it makes management roles a lot harder. We've been doing quite a lot of interviews during the pandemic, particularly with things like contact centres, and they're a fairly good example of the struggle, I guess, that leaders often have. So the agents who were typically office-based have been lifted and shifted into a home-based environment, and actually largely there are some ifs and buts, but largely their job has not changed and they are coping very well. There are issues around their place of work, so it being their home, it might not be ideal for them, but actually, you know, they know when they're working, they know when they're not working, and actually the content of their job has not changed. Their leaders, though, it's changed fundamentally, because a good contact center manager, a good contact center team leader leads by walking around, by sitting by and coaching, by ensuring that everyone is okay. Now they have to do all of that digitally now, and the problem with digital is it's quite formal, isn't it? So we have to keep programming, you know, it all has to be diarized in order to actually do stuff. Therein lies one problem, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think it does put that pressure on leaders, so they have to lead in a very different way. It's good leadership, to be perfectly honest. It's just a more disciplined way of doing it. But I think also leaders without the visual cues, without the office, without the ability to observe behaviours, leaders actually need to make, firstly, purpose very transparent. They need to tell stories, and they need to make culture very, very transparent as well. So they need to call out good and bad behaviours. Now, my anxiety, I guess, going into the future is what I call a horrible hybrid. So in other words, into the future, I don't think we will be working from home wholeheartedly. I don't think we will all be working from an office either. I think it's going to be a combination. And the trouble with that combination is you can get horrible hybrids. And we've had this in BT, to be honest. You have an primarily office-based tribe, and you have a primarily remote tribe. And those two tribes, as Frankie Goes to Hollywood says, can very easily go to war. And there's a lot of very subtle stuff. So on the graph here, this is again new data that we got in one of our surveys. So employees feeling that they need to be in the office to be valued. That's a big one, because if they think that, they're going to try and be in an office. And at the moment, they can't be. But as we release more people, as we release some of the restrictions, there might be that compulsion to be in the office when that might not be the most productive way of working. And that links into the office itself. And this I call the death of Dilbert. Now, Dilbert is a lovely little cartoon character who sits in a cubicle in an office, and I'm not going to kill Dilbert. But even prior to the pandemic, we've been rethinking the role of physical spaces. Now, inevitably, there are obviously in hospitals, you have to have some aspects of physical. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think in terms of prioritizing who needs to be in an office and who doesn't, we've had to do that. We've been forced to do that more than we've ever had to before. And I think what it's exposed is the fact that we can potentially work very effectively from home. And generally what we find from the data is it's about a 70-30 split. So 70% of people have adapted okay, 30% are struggling. And that 30% typically are people that have bad connectivity, are younger typically, more urban, and extroverted. All of those people have really struggled for a number of different reasons. If you're younger, you might still live with your parents, for example, or not have the appropriate space to work. Extroverts pull their energy from people around them, so they've been really struggling. I am, by the way, an introvert, and I've been loving it. So I'm in the 70%. But we've been talking prior to the pandemic around actually it's more about the choices that you make around how, where, and when you work. And those choices could be the home. They could be the office, and I keep saying offices are collaboration tools. Physical spaces are where we go to socialise about work primarily. Obviously, there is some work being done there as well, but a lot of it's around, you know, catching up with people, collaborating with people, communicating with people, and building community. I would say that some of those physical spaces are not necessarily designed to do that, and that's why we were seeing some quite exciting office designs coming up that was less about the number of desks I can fit into a small space and more about how do we encourage people to collaborate more, to communicate more in those spaces. And maybe if they did want to go and do concentrated work like research, for example, they might want to go either to a quiet space in the office or maybe go somewhere else. But there is that midpoint that we, again, have been really accelerating prior to the pandemic, and I think will accelerate even more as we come out of this, which is the co-working space. And the logic behind the co-working space, or the coffice, as I like to call it, because frankly, I only really need a couple of things to work. One is good coffee, and the other one's chocolate. And I do quite like some company. Occasionally, I said I'm an introvert, but sometimes it's nice to just be around other people. So I used to be in coffee shops or hotels or places like that. That's certainly more local to me. I think the one thing I'm looking at the moment is climate change, and we're just doing a piece. We just commissioned a piece on climate change, looking at what's the impact of work on the climate. And I think one of the things we've been looking at is if it's the choice between a 2-hour commute into a centralised office space or walking or cycling to a more co-working localised space, we can probably guess what's going to be the best for the environment. So I do think those co-working spaces are really interesting in terms of putting that into another mix. Now, I would say a lot of this is about, you can't put a one-size-fits-all solution into a lot of this stuff. Because in actual fact, as I mentioned earlier with those human networks, particularly when you're looking at the novel synthesis of ideas, you need diverse people to do that. And I talk about diversity of thought more than necessarily some of the regular definitions of diversity. But I think one of the things we've learned during the pandemic is that actually digital is a great leveler. Now, I have a friend who's based in Scotland. She's in a wheelchair, and she always used to complain to me, why is everything down south? Because although she could get there, it's a struggle for her. And she's absolutely loved this past 8 months because she's been able to go to pretty much everything and contribute to pretty much everything. So I think we need to, that's something that's worked really well, frankly, and we need to keep that. And certainly we do want that diversity of thought. We want contributions from different people. We want to make sure that the platforms and collaboration that we do is accessible to everybody. So I think, this is data pre-pandemic, but if we look at things like working from anywhere, which is another buzzword that's being thrown around at the moment, there are all sorts of benefits to it. One of which it does embrace a little bit more diversity in our workforces. And that links into another D. Gosh, we've got lots of them. You'll be glad to know there's only about 3 left. So the death of distance. Now, this is a particularly interesting one, again, from a knowledge sharing perspective, because I think, telecoms companies have for years been trying to kill distance. And I would say we've kind of succeeded, but not completely, because I think one of the things that we've come out of the pandemic really knowing is that face-to-face is rather valuable. But it isn't necessarily the default for things like knowledge sharing. And as I said, when we look at inclusion, diversity, we might not want to default to face all the time. I'm certainly now thinking, well, should I be getting on a plane for 3 or 4 hours to go to a 20-minute meeting? Probably not. Read, plane, train, automobile, it doesn't really matter. So I think we've learned that we can collaborate at distance, but certainly, again, looking at the data, there's been some really interesting things going on with those human networks. So the first thing is that the pandemic has, I guess, intensified knowledge sharing within specific teams. So within your direct team, there has been a lot of knowledge sharing, and that's been shown by a lot of people sending more email for a start. May not be the best way of sharing knowledge, but certainly, there's been a lot more email with your direct team. We are, oddly enough, using video a lot more, you might have noticed. Now, again, that can be a good or a bad thing. When you link it into meetings, which is another way, of course, of knowledge sharing, we're having more meetings. If you combine meetings and video, you end up with an impending sense of Zoom, I guess. So basically, we're getting a bit of fatigue going on this particular one. Now, that isn't necessarily a problem with video, although I think some people do struggle with, having a camera pointed at them all day. I certainly do. But I think it's more a problem with meetings, to be perfectly honest, because I think what we've done is we've lifted and shifted this world of analog meetings into a digital space, and now they're frictionless. So we don't have to commute, we don't have to move rooms, we can call it at any time, and therefore there's been this compulsion to fill entire days up with meetings. My question, certainly for knowledge sharing, is are meetings the best way of doing this? Because we have a whole ton of collaboration tools out there that are more asynchronous. And I think when you look at remote organizations prior to the pandemic, a lot of them learn a number of valuable lessons. The first thing is don't have quite so many synchronous meetings. And if you do, have them within a mutually agreed time slot, which isn't 9 to 5, by the way. A lot of these remote companies are also global companies, so they need to try and find a time slot that's roughly convenient for everybody. But, you know, it might be 11 till 3. So that's the only time we have meetings. The rest of the collaboration is done largely over asynchronous tools. So everything, well, email might be one of them, but it's not a great collaboration tool, email. Certainly chats, shared spaces, jams, all of those things are becoming a very, very vital way of doing things asynchronously. So we've made stronger ties with our direct team. The problem is the indirect people that we tend to talk to and bump into, so people that aren't in our team, the weaker ties in our network, those have suffered. Now, that then comes into the conversation around serendipity. Now, a lot of people, I get very cross about people saying serendipity can only happen in physical spaces, because I don't think it does happen necessarily exclusively in physical spaces. So it's not all about bumping into people in coffee points. Yes, there is an element of that, but frankly, not all of the interesting people are geographically co-located with you. So I think, again, how we network better in the digital space is one thing that we need to start learning more, because there are tons of interesting serendipitous conversations out there if we go and look at them beyond our physical spaces. But I do think, you know, just generally the pandemic has kind of maybe not stimulated quite so many of those non-purposeful communications. Now, partially that's also because the digital space is very formal. We've had to schedule everything. So we have to actually schedule virtual coffees with interesting people. Now, there are some terrifying technologies that are coming out to try and help you to do this. Microsoft are doing some interesting things around how you can actually start to schedule within your day a more serendipitous encounter. There's a really terrifying app called Donut out there that's like Tinder basically for the workspace. So what it does is it looks at your interests, and it tries and matches you with somebody with similar interests, and then suggests you meet up for a coffee. Again, I'm an introvert. I'm not sure that's going to work with me, but you know, it's an interesting concept. The other thing is we can start to extend out this collaboration beyond the knowledge worker and beyond working at home or working in an office. And certainly the opportunity of 5G, for example, particularly on frontline workers, is a really, really interesting one. Now, this is the coolest project we're working on at the moment. It's our 5G ambulance, actually, and we're piloting this with University Hospital Birmingham, so up in the Midlands. So basically what you can see there is a paramedic. That paramedic is wearing an augmented reality headset. And using 5G, we're actually broadcasting live video, high definition video pictures back to a remote medic. You can see the guy there with a virtual reality headset on. So firstly, the medic in the hospital can literally look through the paramedic's eyes. We've also introduced a haptic glove into this as well. So haptic gloves transmit touch. So again, we can connect the touch from the paramedic into the guy in the hospital. So effectively what's going on is we're collaborating using high definition video and indeed transmitting touch. Now, the idea here basically is so that we can share knowledge much more effectively remotely. So the paramedic can do more because he's being talked through procedures by the guy in the hospital who obviously would be normally doing those procedures. We can hopefully maybe not get quite so many hospital admissions for a start. And if we do need to admit, hopefully we can hand over much more smoothly because the medic is already up to speed with a lot of the things that the paramedic has done. So that's just one brilliant example of how we can extend the collaboration bubble, if you like, right out to the front line. And obviously, you know, we've been looking at this concept of extended reality for a number of years. Now, I have to say, virtual reality does not float my boat. I call it vomity reality. I just don't get on very well with those headsets, and the prospect of me having to wear one for 8 hours a day is not attractive. But I think there are some very interesting case studies around education and simulation, maybe for short periods of time. And certainly the reason you can see Nicola Sturgeon smiling there with our CEO Philip Jansen is we have University of Glasgow on remote education and VR. But we can do an awful lot more with augmented reality, not just the ambulance. We've got our care home as well. So we've been looking at how we can use augmented reality to help people in care homes. The guy in orange is actually a crane inspector in Belfast Harbour. And again, a lot of these people are working with their hands. So, and particularly in medical situations, you don't want people touching technologies because they have to make sure they've sanitized their hands. If you're climbing up a crane, the last thing you really want to do is have a mobile phone in your hand. So what we're trying to do a lot of this collaboration hands-free. So again, with the crane operator, what we can do is we can put a checklist in front of his eye. Again, if he needs a second opinion, he can get an expert on to give a second opinion. We're doing quite a lot with technical diagnostics as well. So you can see a couple of engineers with HoloLenses on there. So we can change the way that engineers actually collaborate. We've even been doing that with customers using the mobile phone. So with our broadband customers at the moment, what we can do with them is, with the customer's permission, take control of the light and the camera on their smartphone. So if they're not sure what they've got plugged in where, we can basically say, show us. And we can use pattern recognition and AI to auto-label all of the wires and the sockets. So that helps the customer to get the right wire in the socket, and it helps the remote advisor to see what's going on, really. Now, for us, that means we don't have to send quite so many engineers out to just go, well, you just got the wrong wire plugged in. And also during this pandemic time, it means we don't have to send engineers into people's houses. Now, we're also doing, I mean, actually, the guy in the blue at the bottom there, it's not something we're doing, but it did blow my mind slightly. So that guy is actually a miner in China. That rhymes, doesn't it? A miner in China. He's doing remote mining from home. So he's driving mining equipment, again, using 5G, and what looks like a very elaborate games console. That, I mean, I'm not sure that is his home, to be perfectly honest, but that kind of technology is interesting because we might assume that it's only knowledge workers that can work from home. He's a blue collar worker, and indeed remote surgery might be possible from home as well. So surgeons could be home working too, we'll see. The other thing we're looking at and taking this even more further forward is holographic collaboration using something called volumetric video. We're playing with this at the moment. It's a bit clunky, but it does fulfill all of my Star Wars fantasies. So I can indeed be a hologram and go, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. So yeah, possibly coming to you, I guess, in the next 10 years. We'll see how the technology actually does develop on that one. My almost final D is the death of Dolly. I think this is a particularly interesting one, largely because, firstly, this is Dolly Parton, by the way, who is not dead. We were just saying her Christmas album is out. She has a Christmas special. I love Dolly. I would never kill her. I mean, she has also funded a vaccine that seems to be pretty successful as well. So she literally has possibly saved the world. But the 9 to 5, of course, has been questionable for a very long time. Certainly in the NHS, it never really has existed anyway. But I think 9 to 5 was a lovely boundary. And again, those boundaries have been crossed when we literally are living at work. And again, I said one of the problems, certainly with home workers, is getting them to turn off. And that has got really detrimental effects to things like well-being. And if we look at the data, it's quite interesting that the data is pointing towards a lot of the younger employees struggling more than maybe some of the older employees in terms of being able to switch off. Now, we've been doing quite a lot of work on something specific called techno-stress. Now, techno-stress is obviously stress about the technologies that we have. And the trouble with those technologies is they can connect us 24 hours a day. As Kevin Kelly says, the problem is not connection anymore, it's disconnection. So this is some work we've been doing with Lancaster, which is my old university, a fantastic lady called Monadeepa Tarafdar. And she's been looking at all sorts of aspects of this techno stress. Everything from I'm having to multitask constantly because my technology just throws things at me from multiple channels and I have to try and respond. And certainly if you're doing something detailed, complex, involving knowledge, certainly, that's a really inefficient and unproductive way of working, and actually quite a tiring way of working. So multitasking is not productive. We know this. So sometimes we need to figure out how to single task and turn everything off. All of those distractions have to go in order to get us to get productive and particularly complex tasks. Then, of course, technology does move quite fast. Some people might perceive it as being quite difficult. So we can't just assume a level of technical literacy. We need to handhold. And I think the pandemic has accelerated the use of technologies that most of us probably hadn't used before, and we've adopted them pretty well. But I think we have had to be handheld for a few things. Certainly, just even what does this do for me? We need to explain that. Then, of course, there is this pressure to be always on. A lot of the stuff that we've done on that particular one is with Cambridge University. We did some work a while back with them, which we've just republished, and I've actually just got a chapter published in Kerry Cooper's new book on flexible working, looking at what we called the balanced communication diet for business, because the Cambridge diet was taken, sadly. But this is a diet. It's a 5-step plan to better communications behaviour, and it's about questioning all sorts of things. So typically there are 3 things that make us less productive. Meetings, already covered those. Email, maybe we're sending a bit too much. There's also stream stress as well, so that can be problematic. And then managers. And again, I think new home workers, and we've maybe all settled down into a routine now, but new home workers always report guilt when they're taking a break or walking the dog, or all of those things, which actually make you more productive, not less productive. It's unhealthy to sit at your desk for 7 hours a day. So that Cambridge stuff is available if anyone's interested. We then got this insecurity piece, which I think is a big one at the moment, because we know that we're going to go into a very, very deep recession, if not a depression economically. So there's reports that we might get about 10% unemployment in the UK. So people are going to feel insecure, and that means that they have to demonstrate that they're really valuable. They're always on. They're very, 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 very valuable. And again, that can lead to burnout if you manage that badly. So I think that's one thing we need to think about. The second thing we need to think about, and this is my final D, you'll be very, very glad to know, is AI and automation. I call this the rise of the droid. Again, that's my Star Wars geekiness coming out. But I think AI, the hype on it has kind of waned a bit. This is again a mixture of research that we've done, one around UK adoption of technologies, and you'll see that actually AI has not really been embraced by UK businesses yet. I don't think that's because they think it's useless. It's just I don't think that the technologists have actually demonstrated the business results that that key decision makers want from AI. I think in the medical field, there are some very interesting case studies, particularly with things like mammograms. I know Google have done quite a lot around comparing the efficiency of reading the mammogram. So normally you need 2 radiographers to do that. Actually, what they found is that if you just apply AI to a mammogram, it's not great. Actually, it's lower than the 2 radiographers in terms of accuracy. But if you pair a radiographer with the AI, it goes up to higher accuracy than the 2 radiographers. So this points towards the fact that this isn't about replacing humans. Actually, it's about augmenting humans. So I've always called artificial intelligence augmented intelligence. So this is a lot to do with gluing the strengths of the human being with the strengths of the machine. Now, partially, that's about using our human beings to teach machines. This is some stuff we actually did again in the contact center space around knowledge sharing. And the fact that actually our humans add a lot. They can pick up when machines failed, they can solve complex problems, they can negotiate solutions to be win-win. They've got a lot of knowledge in their heads. So all of these people have very unique skills that are largely in their brain. So all of that tacit knowledge that we have, that's very hard to write down. Now, we can use all of these people to train the AIs as well. So how do we actually encourage people to share and improve the AI, quality control the AI? So we're trainers of the AI, we have to explain the AI as well, because it's a bit of a black box at the moment. So how did the AI get to that decision? And we need to make sure that that AI is being ethical. So the humans are not cut out at all. What it is putting humans and machines together. And I think, again, we need to sell that concept, I think, a little bit better in the AI field, because it's not about replacing people at all. As I said, you might not need 2 radiographers to read a mammogram now, but frankly, you're not going to make the other radiographer redundant, because we need a lot of radiographers. So, you know, it is really around trying to improve productivity and efficiency, but it doesn't necessarily imply ripping people out. It does, however, imply that we might need slightly different skill sets, because machines are very good when there's rules and processes and procedures. We're really good when there's anarchy and chaos, and complex problem solving and empathy and caring and all that lovely stuff we are really good at doing. The problem is all of those latter things that we're good at doing are increasingly difficult to measure and not necessarily prioritized in terms of the skill sets that we develop back into education. So I think we've got some quite interesting challenges as we get into a more automated environment, but it isn't about replacing humans at all, which I think is a good note to finish on. So if you're interested in any of that research, most of it is available. If you're having trouble sleeping, we've got everything from how to homework better, through to how AI might fit in, through to how we collaborate. And of course, the balanced communication diet that I mentioned earlier is also available if you are struggling with techno stress. So I'm going to shut up now and yeah, open the floor up. Let's see if I can stop sharing as well. There we go. Any questions?
Thank you, Nicola, for a great presentation. I'm with you on the virtual reality thing, though they don't agree with me either.
I'm not the only one.
No, absolutely not. We've got a question in the chat already from Victoria. Helen Bevan talks about the idea of there being 3% of people in an organisation that are influencers, connectors. Is that something you see in BT, and any tips on how to identify that 3%?
Absolutely. Firstly, I love Helen. She's great. And yes, I think it probably is. It's certainly under 10%, I would say, are people that are naturally good connectors and influencers. But as I said, it is a skill. Julia Hobsbawm at Cass Business School has actually been looking at how do you teach that skill? How do you teach people to network better? Because, you know, we probably can all network a lot better than we do at the moment. It's just that for a lot of us, particularly introverts like me, it's actually completely out of my comfort zone to do that, but actually making that effort and making those connections can be really, really good. And as I said, you know, I think leaders need to be able to establish both purpose and connection in order for those ideas to start to get executed. So yeah, I think it certainly sounds reasonable that it might be around 3%. Yeah.
And in terms of trying to pick out who they might be, have you got any top tips?
That's I mean, firstly, you probably know, because they're the people that everyone knows, and I mean, they are that perfect connector. We have also been looking at data. So MIT especially has been doing something which is fairly controversial. It's called social physics. But what it does is it takes data and it actually identifies those people because they are effectively those little circles that connect lots of other people. But they do that by in physical space, they actually literally fitted people with little badges. We could actually do the same thing using location on Wi-Fi, to be perfectly honest, as well. So we can figure out who's actually connecting with who in physical spaces. We can look at email, we can look at chat, we can look at social media. Now, that provides you with some really interesting data. But as I mentioned earlier, that can get a bit creepy. And we have had a bit of a negative backlash on that around, well, I'm not sure I want people to know if I'm a good connector or not. So I think we can use a number of ways of identifying those people, whether it's data or instinct, but they are out there for sure.
Thank you. Question from Katie. How do we ensure that the digital workplace doesn't widen the divide between the tech savvy and the tech averse? And what do you think our role in this would be?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big concern. I mean, generally, it's also the economically disadvantaged as well. And we have seen the pandemic largely open a gap even further between the economically advantaged and disadvantaged. So I think those two problems often go hand in hand. I mean, certainly BT one of our missions, our new CEO, well, he's not so new now, he's been in post about 2 years, but Philip has been very passionate around how do we improve the digital literacy in the UK. So he's actually taken that on, and certainly within BT, we're trying our best basically to try and get some of our technologists out to talk about technology to people that aren't necessarily quite as techno savvy as maybe some of the general population. So how do we increase the digital literacy of the UK? I think is one very big challenge, and certainly I think the NHS has a role to play in that as well. We've been looking at certainly from a workplace perspective, this idea of a good day at work. And that ranges from everything from technical literacy through to well-being, healthcare, financial literacy. All of those things I think will go hand in hand, because it's not just one facet of a problem. It's not just the technology. There's a whole raft of other things that we need to look at. So we've been looking at sort of trying to broker relationships and say, well, how could we paint this picture of a good day at work? We can do the technology bit, but maybe we've been looking at partnering with a bank around financial well-being, certainly NHS. We've been looking at a very big global food supplier as well around nutrition, to basically maybe just provide a little bit of advice as to how potentially you could do all of this better. So digital is one very important component of that, but I think it is if you're looking at the bigger trends, the economic divide is an incredibly big one that we really do need to address.
Yeah, and we're exploring it in the context of health literacy and how people understand that health information piece, because it's still a key thread through. Absolutely. Question from Rachel. Thanks very much for a great presentation. I was interested when you said that there's been research suggesting that younger workers are finding home working more difficult than older workers. I was wondering if the research has explored the reasons why this might be the case.
Sure. As I said, I mean, I touched upon it. I think it's easy to just paint younger workers as one big blob. There are younger workers that have been embracing it, but I think there are some difficulties that certainly some of our interviews have found. Firstly, a lot of them are in smaller houses, so simply the logistics of home working, and they might be in shared houses as well. As I said, some are still living with their parents, so the actual workspace isn't necessarily ideal for them. But a lot of them are also at the beginning of their career, and some of them are very ambitious as well. So I think a lot of them are sort of saying, well, how do I demonstrate how valuable I can be? But also there's a learning component, as you guys all know. So they're still learning on the job. And again, they can't just observe behaviours, or they have to make an effort to connect now. And again, that formalised digital workplace, some of them are better than others. Certainly I've had a lot of connections from our graduates, but then I'm quite high profile and I hope I'm quite approachable. So, you know, having conversations with them. But I think, again, it's all about connection. So how do they establish connections in a world that maybe they've only just stepped into? And it also applies to new employees of any age, to be perfectly honest. If they've just come into an organisation, some of them have struggled a little bit more around, well, what is this organisation about and how do I learn the cultural norms when I can't just look around and see the branding and see the culture and see the behaviours? And again, that's not impossible to do in digital. It's to do in digital.
Yeah, we've had a few examples of people starting jobs on day one of lockdown and the challenges that come. Here's your laptop, please leave. So yeah, it is a challenge. Question from Heather. Have you seen any difference, culture change in virtual meetings compared to traditional face-to-face? I'm seeing people that are still scheduling an hour for everything and trying to replicate virtually exactly what they did in a face-to-face meeting. I'm looking for tips for change.
Too right. I mean, I think, to be honest, right at the beginning of our research, when I interviewed quite a lot of our teleworkers, our guys that have been home working for a long time, things that they instantly said is don't schedule 1 hour and 30-minute meetings, schedule 50-minute and 25-minute meetings. And actually Microsoft now, there is now, if you're using the calendar, they actually now have a setting that you can set that schedules 25-minute and 50-minute meetings rather than 30-minute and 1 hour ones. Now, the rationale behind that is obviously it's actually good to have a stretch and go to the toilets and have a coffee and, you know, just back-to-back meetings are incredibly unhealthy and actually probably not that productive. So Absolutely. I think we're starting to learn the lessons there around how do we schedule a meeting. I think you're right in terms of, I think some people have just lifted and shifted that entire concept of a meeting. I think the data tends to point towards meetings being more efficient. And that means, so there's good and bad news there. So we're having more meetings, they're shorter meetings, they're very efficient meetings, they're agendarized. But the trouble is we know that that isn't all that meetings are about. And again, back to that serendipitous bit, often the valuable bit of a meeting, a physical meeting, is probably that 10 minutes before when you're getting your coffee and biscuits, and that 10 minutes after when you're clearing your stuff up and ready to leave. That's often the bit where the interesting connections start to develop. So the question then is, can we maybe reintroduce some of those informal things before the agenda kicks in? Now, I know this is going into getting a meeting longer again, but I know a few people have introduced sort of lobby sessions, you know, have a 5-minute kind of before the formal agenda kicks in, have 5 minutes at the beginning and 5 minutes at the end, where if anyone does want to hang around and just have a conversation that's not part of the agenda can do that. So yeah, that's one way of doing it. Obviously you could do that more asynchronously as well, so you don't have to have a meeting about that. So yeah, I think, I mean, my biggest tip would be, yeah, 25-minute meetings, 50-minute meetings, not half an hour and 1 hour, because that definitely takes some of the strain off. But I think we do need to be much more creative around how we reintroduce that sort of more informal aspect to meetings into what is a very formal space in digital.
I like the lobby idea, actually. I quite like that. But yes, as someone who's on calls from 1 till 5 this afternoon with no breather in between, I'm quite, we need to be smart. We need to be smarter at it. Does anybody have any other questions for Nicola? Everybody's appreciative of the questions and the answers that you've given, but I'm not seeing any more in the chat, but we will continue to monitor it. Thank you very much, Nicola. That was super interesting. I'm gonna hand over. Do stay for the next bit of the goldfish if you would like to, but I'm gonna hand